the next chapter, chapter 5, the chapter on language. And I would like to remind you to go to week 11 and click on to the chapter 5 key term slides. Make sure you make a copy of that for yourself and put in the definition and examples. And I would encourage an illustration as we go through this. So just make sure you get that done. All right, as we begin, we're going to start with the languages of the world, kind of looking at it from a larger perspective. We believe that there are about 7,000 languages in the world. We don't know exactly how many. I've seen some textbooks where they say it's closer to 9,000. I've seen some textbooks that say it's closer to 5,000. So we're going to go somewhere in the middle and just say that it's about 7,000 languages in the world. And that number is decreasing really every year. As areas that have a limited number of speakers, maybe a couple hundred or a couple thousand, as the older people start to die off in that group, and the younger people, if they decide to move from that place, they decide that they don't want to pick up the language or continue speaking the language, or they want to go to another language in terms of maybe that language is going to be more beneficial for them to learn, then they may not pick up those indigenous languages that may exist in rainforests or mountain, high up in mountain pockets, maybe in like a desert or something like that. So we know that that number is declining each year. In terms of the language that's the languages that are most spoken on Earth, by far the number one that has the most native speakers would be Mandarin. And so you're talking about over 1 billion people grow up, in their family from birth speaking Mandarin. Now, if we change that slightly and we say, what's the language that most people speak as a number one or a number two language? So in other words, their native language plus another language, and that becomes English. And, there's more people that speak English as a first or second language combined than is Mandarin. And that's mostly because of British colonization, English, American global dominance in terms of the economy, the military. And so, if you're going to do business with America, you need to speak our language. All right, so as we get into the key terms here, language is a system of communication based on sounds. You could modify this definition to sounds and symbols that have agreed upon meaning by the group that speaks it or writes it, however you want to look at it. But if if I say the word mom, so however that sounds, mom, you have something that comes to your mind, and you have your mother when you say the word mom. And all of us have that kind of agreed upon idea that when we make that sound, mom, that we make that word, that sound of that word means something to all of us. And it's an agreed upon meaning. That's a language. So if you need an example of a language, just go ahead and use one of the, about 50 or 100 that you see on the screen there below. All right, so this is a family tree of languages, and this is our language family. This is the Indo-European language family. So we're going to be talking about Indo-European and kind of how we belong to it and languages that are related to us. When we look at a language family is a collection of languages that were related to one another in a common ancestor long before we started writing history and what we would say recording history. So, or written history is another way to look at it. All right. So these languages are going to go back a long time. We're talking like thousands and thousands of years. Whereas a language branch is going to be a collection of languages that date back to when we started written history. And so again, if we're part of a language family, those relationships amongst different languages, they go back before written language existed. But if we're part of a language branch, then basically what you need to understand is that's more recent. That's going to be a language that diverged from our language, a couple hundred years ago rather than a couple thousand years ago. Okay, now if we go back and we take a look at it, so I can give you guys some examples. So here is a language family, and our language family is called Indo-European. And there's about 10 total language families that you need to know when you guys are doing your geography of language. So you could use Japanese, Korean, um, Austroasiatic, Austronesian, Afroasiatic, Niger Congo, whatever you guys want to use. Just pick one of the language families as an example. But our language family is Indo-European. Now, if you look at the top of the tree, they have the branches up there. And so you can see that English, where we are part of the Germanic branch of the Indo-European family. And then we are, if you kind of broke it down further, we are in the West Germanic or the Western Germanic group of the Germanic branch of the Indo-European language family. And you can kind of see all the different language branches that are part of Indo-European. All right, next, we're going to talk about where did your language come from? Where did English come from? How did it originate? Well, English itself is what we call a creole. It's a mixture language. In other words, you have various groups contributing to the language that you know of as English. There originally, I guess you could say, there was no English. It sort of developed out of a combination between Celtic, Germanic, and French languages. And even though these languages today that I'm talking about, Germanic or French, they're not exactly Germanic and French. They're Germanic and French-like. And so the first group that really is of note, and we want to kind of focus on the map down there in the bottom right-hand corner, and we're talking about the British Isle, the island that we know as Great Britain today. The first major inhabitants of that island were the Celts, and the Celts had their own language, and it was very different than what you would think today. You wouldn't be able to understand them. And that language has been around since 2000 BC on the British Isles. In 450 AD, groups from what we would call today Germany and Denmark invaded Great Britain. And you don't need to know why. You'll learn about it in world history. But as those Germanic peoples, those Germanic tribes, the Jutes, the Angles, and the Saxon, as they invade, they subjugate, they mix with, they kind of push out those Celtic people. But in doing so, they start to pick up words from the Celts, words that like the Celts, if they had a word to describe a certain geographical feature that the Germanic groups had never seen before, they might start adopting that word to use for that particular geographical feature. And so you start to see over a long period of time that the Germanic language of the Angles, the Jutes, and Saxons, it kind of changes and sort of assimilates into their language, those Celtic words for different things. And then if we fast forward to 1066, we have the Norman invasion of Great Britain, where William the Conqueror, who is of Normandy, of northwest France, he and his French forces invade and basically take over England for about 300 years. And as they did that, most of the official language documents and things like that were written in French. Well, again, inevitably, that French language that came across the English Channel, that started mixing with the Celtic elements and the Germanic elements that were around Britain at this time. And so, their languages ended up mixing together, and the result of that is what we call today English. Now, if you've ever wondered where the term England comes from, if you look over to Denmark there, or what today is Denmark, there's a group of people from that angle where Denmark makes kind of a 90-degree angle with where the Saxons were there in northern Germany. And those people were basically called the Angles. And so when they moved and took over what we now call Great Britain today, they called that the land of the Angles, or England. And that's where England comes from. All right. Official language. So this is a key term you'll need to get down. Official language is the language that is used by the government to conduct business for the publication of different documents. And so this would be like a stamp, or like a dollar bill, for in our case, or the British pound that you can see on there. Road signs, anything that the government is putting forth as a sign, if it has that language on it. Typically, we see that as the official language. Now, some countries will go so far as to make laws that establish something be printed in, as an official language. So like up in Quebec in Canada, for a number of years, if you had a restaurant, you had to put the outside of the restaurant, whatever the name of the restaurant was, you had to put that in French by law. You couldn't put it in English. Now, the United States does not actually have an official language. It more just kind of turns out that way. If you see like a dollar bill, it's going to be in English. If you look at a stamp, it's going to be in English, and road signs are going to be in English. But technically, by the law, they don't have to be. Some states will make official laws concerning declaring that they have an official language, but the country of the United States does not have an official language. And there's some examples for you. All right, so the last ones I'm going to cover today are going to be Pidgin and Creole. And Pidgin and Creole kind of result from the mixing of different languages. So Pidgin is usually a rough combination of two different languages. And we typically see this as something that results from things like colonization. So, if a colonizer comes over, they're going to make the subjugated people learn their language. Well, the subjugated people don't always speak it as perfectly well as the colonizing language people speak it. And so they're going to make kind of a rough combination between their language and the colonizer's language, and often it won't be very grammatically correct. And so, for example, if I speak a different language and I hear my colonizer say, go get me a chair, then they're not going to be able to speak it that clearly, because if I say it kind of quickly, go get me a chair, they might just say, get them chair. And so you're going to have, and a good example of this is what happens with people of English descent that have slaves in the South, at least initially early on. So like in South Carolina, this Creole that ends up developing, it starts out as a pidgin, and it's called Gullah. And in Gullah, instead of saying, go get me a chair, they would just shorten it up to make it what they could understand, which was get them chair. So instead of go get me a chair, the pidgin of that would be like, get them chair, like go get me a chair. Okay. Now Creole is then a completely different language like English that develops, and it probably starts as a pidgin, but as it develops over time, then what happens is you don't have the colonizer's language necessarily, and you don't have the people that are getting colonized, but you get almost like a third language that develops that is somewhat different. And if we look at English is a great example of a Creole because it's not Germanic and it's not French, even though there's elements of those languages in there. So for example, if we're speaking English, we're going to pick up words that are both French and German. So if you're talking about the German words that are present, look at something like Mater or Vater, mother or father, or kindergarten. Those are German words that are now part of what we call the English language. But then you can pick up the elements of French in our language too, maison for mansion, or magnificent, or something like that, where you have a French word exquisite, but now that's part of the English language. And so it typically, when you get two foreign languages that are trying to communicate with each other, they start off in simple monosyllabic communications, contractions of two words into one, and we call that pidgin. Whereas when a completely different language results from those two languages that originally collided with each other, we call it a Creole. Another good example of a Creole would be Swahili. So you take the language of the Arabic traders, so you take Arabic and then you mix it with elements from Niger-Congo languages, and they are neither those Niger-Congo languages, or it's not Arabic, it's a new language that is totally mixed together and created a different language called Swahili, and that's a Creole. Okay, that is enough for today. This is all you need to get done for the weekend for Chapter 5.